Hello, everybody. So recently I was invited to a conference down in Austin, Texas that was hosted by the Meaning Alignment Institute, and they talked about their moral graph technology. And one of the things that I wanted to do was share that technology. I've interviewed one of the co-founders, Ellie Hine, a couple times across my various channels, but I wanted to extend the conversation just a little bit further and talk about kind of how I see the government possibly running in the future. And it's what I call nebulocracy. Now, before we jump in, I want to point out that the moral graph technology is theirs, but the nebulocracy this is my idea editorializing. So I just didn't want to confuse anyone up front by saying that they are proposing nebulocracy. That's my idea, but I'm using their technology as a jumping off point. So without further ado, let's jump in. So the Meaning Alignment Institute was founded by Joe, Ellie, and Oliver, and they're great folks. They're all good friends, and the foundational kind of theory of their foundation is that of the moral graph. So the moral graph is basically was kind of come up with because they wanted to think of a different way of optimizing online platforms. So what I mean by this is that online platforms like from LinkedIn and TikTok and Facebook and all of them, including here on YouTube, they're all optimized for engagement. So this is called attention engineering. And they have all kinds of data streams based on everything from linger time, like how long you linger on a particular page or image, to the kinds of things that you click on, and so on and so forth. And so the algorithms today, all that they have to go on is those basic numbers of time. And so they don't know why you are, engaging with certain content or certain people or certain ideas. They just know that they get more time and attention. So whether that's outrage, whether that's thirst traps, and so on and so forth. And so what Joe realized when he came up with this idea originally was that these were not wise uses of time. They were engaging uses of time, but they were engaging the limbic system or deeper, more primitive structures of the brain. And so the whole idea was, how do you create algorithms that optimize for wisdom rather than just basic engagement? So that is kind of the genesis story of where the Meaning Alignment Institute is today. Now, we do have to move forward because, of course, the title of this video is Artificial Super Wisdom, because that is now kind of their ostensibly stated goal, is not just artificial super intelligence, but artificial super wisdom. And so the easiest way that I have thought of differentiating between intelligence versus wisdom is that intelligence is the ability to solve problems and achieve goals. That's the ability to do it, but not necessarily the why. So it's the what or the how, but wisdom is the why, understanding why you should solve certain problems and why you should solve them in a certain way. And so that leads to this right here, which is basically overall state improvement. So a wise choice is not necessarily saying, like, I'm going to solve this problem because X. It's saying, I'm going to solve this problem because it will get me into a wiser state of being. That is one way to think about wisdom. Now, you can say that there's definitely a lot of overlap. Wisdom also takes into account, ethics and morality. So a wiser person will make a more, pro-social decision that is better for everyone, that sort of thing. Whereas, solving a problem just on a mathematical level, the problem is solved. You now have, a solution to whatever the stated goal is. Again, it is kind of down to semantics, but there is kind of something je ne sais quoi about saying artificial super wisdom versus artificial super intelligence. So that leads us to moral graphs. So moral graphs are the technology that they introduce, and they are you can imagine them if you're not familiar with this idea, which you might not be. Is you take a knowledge graph, which a knowledge graph is an interconnected set of nodes and edges with relationships between each of those nodes, and those are informational relationships. But the way that the moral graph works, and by the way, this is an oversimplification, just because I am here. I'm just the messenger. I'm not the researcher. But basically, a moral graph is a state of situations or contexts, and then each of the linkages in a moral graph is a decision or an action. So it's like a story. You move from one state to the next based on decisions, and what you do is the linkages are the actions, but then you can also attach metadata to each of those actions and decisions based on which option creates more wisdom. And so a way you can imagine it in this graph is that the thinner a line is, the less wise the decision is. And the thicker the line is, that is where there's more agreement that that is the wiser decision. And so then you can actually plot out, like kind of almost a choose your own adventure of actions and decisions that lead you from one state to another based on potential actions. And so that is like the very, very high level of the moral graph theory. Now, one thing is, and this is demonstrated in their research. They do have a research paper published up on Archive. The link should be in the description, and I'll refer to it in a slide or two. But one thing that's very interesting is in testing their moral graph theory, they very deliberately took demographics, like different groups of people, with ostensibly diametrically opposed views on things. The primary example being they took Democrats and Republicans here in America and asked them about situations like abortion. And what they were able to find is that generally you can still get to 90% agreement on what is the wise choice to make. Because we're all humans and we often have underlying similar values, even if the ultimate choice that we would make might be a little bit different. Every story is a series of choices. And so when you think about the fact that we can get 80 to 90% agreement with this technology by surfacing underlying values and by surfacing underlying wisdom, that really changes the game. Because think of the fact that right now democracy is about the first past the post. This is a 50% wins. But what if we have a technology that allows us to say, you know what, only decisions with 70% agreement win or 80% agreement win? We will have a much, much higher rate of consensus in this nation and potentially in this world, as I'll talk about nebulocracy in a minute. But before we got to that, you needed to understand a little bit more about what the moral graph is, and we will go in greater detail about how to use it. But I just wanted to point out that this is a technology that allows for very, very high rates of agreement, and the fact that it can allow for consensus on a massive scale, that is earth-shattering. That is game-changing. Now, when we talk about values, there is a really important distinction here, and that is that a value in a moral graph is a source of meaning. And so this is, if you're not familiar with it, this is kind of a particular kind of way of articulating what a value is. And so a source of meaning is basically, here's kind of how I think about it, is there are some things that you don't really care about, that, there's political issues or social issues or scientific issues that you're more or less ambivalent about. Like, yes, it might be important, but you just personally don't care on a visceral level, or maybe a spiritual level. It just doesn't really mean that much to you. But then there can be things that you do care a lot about. For me, here's a practical example. For me, as a man, the issue of abortion is not about I don't care about oh, we must protect babies. I'm not pro-life like that. For me, the source of meaning is protecting the autonomy of adult women, or girls in some cases. So that is a source of meaning. So my value comes from bodily autonomy, where someone else's source of meaning might come from protecting the defenseless. But as the meaning alignment folks pointed out in their presentation, even for people who are very different, ostensibly either on a spiritual or political level, there's often very similar underlying values, such as the need to protect the innocent, or those kinds of things, or the need to stand up for marginalized groups, as another example. But when you are able to surface the deeper values, the deeper sources of meaning in any of these contentious issues, and identify the path to wisdom, what you often will find is that on even contentious issues, people with different worldviews will still generally agree on the path to wisdom. And then if you have a data structure, not just a data structure, but an artificial intelligence trained on this, then you have a way of algorithmically guiding the rest of the world on the wisdom that humans actually agree on. And that is very remarkable. So that leads to artificial super wisdom. So one of the projects that they're working on right now is actually taking these moral graphs, so taking the data that they have extracted from, from the test subjects and actual humans. They've extracted literally hundreds of different values from people on issues. Now they're working on training it into language models or transformers. So the idea is, if this all works out, we will have artificial intelligence models that are trained on the actual values of humans, the actual wisdom of humans. And so then it will be able to definitively say, in any given context, now it's obviously a toy data set right now, but in any given context that it is trained on, it will know in the affirmative what values humans actually value, like what sources of meaning humans value, and it will know how to make with confidence in its assertion, saying, yes, we should do this. This is the wise decision, and this is why we believe it is the wise decision. And here's, the alternatives and why we view those as less wise decisions. Now, obviously, that's not necessarily to take away agency from humans, but rather it is a way to aggregate the collective wisdom of many humans in arbitrarily sized environments, such as in a nation with 300 million people, or as I hope in one day in the future, maybe a century or two from now, where we can coordinate 10 billion humans across the entire planet. And I'll talk about that more in just a second. But we got to first get through artificial super wisdom and how the government works today. So here's an example value card. This is the actual value card that I generated during this presentation. And so basically, this is more like a personal value card. So my value card this is where I get my highest sense of meaning. And so you can actually go to it. They have a customized chat GPT, so you can use it. It's in the link. Description is also in the link. And also here's their paper, which outlines the moral graph and surfacing values or sources of meaning. And so for me, this perfectly captured my highest source of meaning, which is to solve problems. Empowered problem solving. So I call myself a systems thinker. So they said I'm an empowered problem solver. You know what? Close enough. But yeah, so you are welcome to try this yourself. It's a short exercise. It only takes a couple minutes. But also you can talk about sources of meaning in other contexts as well. Now, before we get to nebulocracy, as promised, we do have to unpack kind of how the government works today. So right now, due to limitations in technology when our government was founded, more than 200 years ago, closer to 250 years ago, we had come up with this idea of representative democracy. Now, representative democracy is nothing new. The Roman Empire had the Senate, and then we've had Parliament in many European countries for centuries, and then America, of course, has Congress, and then we also have Congress at state levels as well. So what we do is, in order to assess the collective wisdom of the masses here in a representative democracy, what we do is we have polls, we have elections, and we elect representatives. We delegate our decision making, and ideally, what happens is we choose people whose values align with ours, and so then they will go and advocate on our behalf in the apparatus of government. And so the values are basically saying, hey, I'm going to choose an avatar. I'm going to choose a champion who shares my values and the things that I think should be, paid attention to. And then they will go and help make decisions, collective decisions. And so by having these layers of decision making, where you have humans go and elect based on their party, and because you have primary elections where you have within the Democratic Party, let's make a choice about who we're going to send, and then the main election is is, Democrats versus Republicans. And so by almost having this ladder, right, this tiered approach of making the decision of who's going to represent these people, for this cycle, that whole idea is that we should end up with wiser and wiser leadership. Now, of course, most people hate government, which it's like, as George Carlin pointed out, it's like you elected them. Why do you hate them? You put them there. But again, part of the problem here is that it is first past the post. And often we have only a few choices given to us because running for elected office is expensive. And so then you end up with like, okay, you've got 5 different choices and you end up having to pick the lesser of 5 evils or, whatever. So there's always going to be trade-offs. And this is one thing that I want to point out is that there's always going to be trade-offs with any governance system that you have. But right now, this is the best that we've got. And it's pretty stable. And there are some major advantages to democracy, namely that it comes with a built-in pressure release valve. And it allows for regular cadence and structured change. Because one of the biggest problems with older systems, namely monarchy, is that there are no pressure release valves. And so then you can end up with a rigidity in the system that does not allow for regular change and evolution. So as I was talking about, there's plenty of problems with democracy. It can be slow, whereas, top-down, more authoritarian or totalitarian regimes can implement change much faster and in a much more coordinated manner. But that comes at the expense of civil liberties, for instance. Democracy can also be incredibly messy. It can be chaotic, it can be noisy, there can be vitriol and mudslinging. But as I read many years ago, I wish I could remember which book it was. But basically, the vitriol and mudslinging is democracy functioning. That is a sign of a healthy functioning democracy. And I remember I read it in the context of India, because India, of course, got rid of British influence, less than a century ago, or about when was it? I think it was 80 years ago. Anyways, and so India, with its many, many hundreds of subcultures and ethnicities and religions, is a very messy democracy. And when the book that I was reading pointed out that, like, yes, democracy seems very messy and chaotic in India, but that is actually a sign of a functioning democracy. And I remember, I think it was my U.S. history teacher in high school actually agreed with this sentiment, basically saying that, the reason that noise and chaos is a sign of a healthy democracy is because look at regimes where you're not allowed to speak out. Look at Russia and China and North Korea, where speaking out can get you in trouble, either thrown in jail or disappeared. So yeah, noise is good. That is the First Amendment working as intended. Now, that's the good side, but you can also say that it's a mixed bag because it comes with chaos and stress and identity politics and all that fun stuff. Representative democracy is also susceptible to corruption. Namely because when you take a nation of 300 million people and you coordinate it with 500 to 600 individuals, that means that you have 500 or 600 individuals that are highly targeted for lobbyists and bribery and other kinds of coercion and manipulation. So that includes Congress, that includes the Senate, that includes the courts. Right now there's plenty of evidence that some of the Supreme Court justices have been bribed with vacations. And those are examples of flawed institutions or a flawed democracy. However, in the grand scheme of things, as I mentioned, ultimately, in an ideal world, democracy will ultimately reflect the wisdom of the people. But you can also there's plenty of evidence throughout history in America that there is often a very big disconnect between the behaviors of government and the actual wisdom of the people, namely because of machine politics and lobbyists. So now I want to introduce the concept of nebulocracy. So basically, imagine that we take the combination of moral graphs, artificial intelligence, and artificial super wisdom, and we collect the values of all Americans. So this is just for the sake of argument. We're just imagining doing democratic reforms here in America. So you take the moral graph and you have a national level moral graph that is stored publicly in a blockchain or something along those lines. You want absolute transparency. You also want to protect the privacy of individuals, but it is continuously updated with the morals, the values, the sources of meaning, and the graph is continuously being refined and expanded through, decentralized input. And again, all the data is kept transparent. And so rather than going to the polls to select a politician, rather than voting saying, hey, I'm going to vote for this avatar, I'm going to vote for my champion, you're just going to express your values into this data structure, into this moral graph. And then either through a combination of training agents, artificial intelligence models on that data, or training models that are able to use and interpret that data, or in all likelihood, a combination of the two. Because, what is AI? It's AI that's trained on data, but then it's also a machine that can interact with data. So a little bit of both. But what we can do then is we can actually, to a very, very high level of granularity, because right now democracy is very low granularity. Again, we ultimately delegate the control of our world, to a couple hundred local representatives, your town council and your state Congress, and then your federal Congress. And so, the number of people affecting your way of life is probably, around about 1,000 to 2,000 people, maybe more depending on how big you look at it, but the point is that it's, less than 10,000 people in a nation of 300 million are influencing your way of life. And of course, these are individuals that are susceptible to, human foibles and corruption, and just plain old ignorance. But instead, what if you can have the collective wisdom of all 300 million of your fellow Americans, and it is embedded in a system where you can get up to 90% consensus on what the wise choices are? So that, to me, represents a potential path forward. Now, obviously, this is a fundamentally different approach to government, and would not, could not, and should not be implemented quickly due to the law of unintended consequences, which I will cover in a minute in terms of ways that this could go sideways. But I think that this is worth exploring. So voting in nebulocracy would be, rather than, again, voting for a particular avatar, it's values-based input. Now, one thing that I will say is part of democracy is the ritualized ceremony of going to the polls and voting, and you get your little sticker saying I voted. It's like you get the warm fuzzies for participating in your civic engagement. But one thing that I think of as possible is you could create voting kiosks that are kind of everywhere, and smartphone apps and web interfaces that allow people to continuously input their values. So basically, like, anytime you think of a value, you can, I can think of any number of ways of integrating this. You can have a text message-based system. You can have an email-based system. You can have polling places. But the idea is that the more people interact with the nebulocracy moral graph, the wiser the moral graph gets. And now, one thing you could think of is like, okay, well, what if someone expresses their values more into the system than somebody else? And that is a fair point. But again, remember, if this system surfaces values with up to 90% convergence on what people agree with on wisdom, then one person expressing their values more than someone else won't necessarily make it asymmetrical, but there's also ways that you can keep track of who is adding value so that you equally weight, you isometrically weight all of the input from every individual. This is possible with blockchain technology and so on and so forth. But another advantage to this is that it is scalable, because it's like, okay, you say, oh, well, how do you coordinate the values of 300 million Americans? Imagine that you have 300 million people each putting in 1,000 values, and that's a lot. That would take a while to input, but just bear with me. Thought experiment. That would be 300 billion data points that you integrate into a moral graph. In the grand scheme of things, 300 billion data points is a pretty trivial amount of data to train AI on right now. That would actually be a relatively small model compared to like GPT-4 or Claude. So yeah, just in terms of the scale that we're at, that is already, I'm not going to say like it's tiny, but it is certainly not anywhere near the scale of the foundation models that are being trained today on literally trillions, if not hundreds of trillions of tokens. So this moral graph, a nation-sized moral graph, with this thought experiment would be several orders of magnitude smaller than what Microsoft and Google and Meta are training right now. So then, let's imagine in Nebulocracy, it's implemented. We have a national scale moral graph. What do you do with it? Like, okay, great, Dave. Like, I get it. We have a moral graph that reflects all the collective wisdom of all Americans, and it can get up to 90% consensus on any particular issue. So there's a few things that you can do with it. First, you can use it to shape legislation. So rather than having, potentially crooked or stupid politicians all arguing about legislation, you instead have the moral graph used to shape the legislation. Either AI trained on it to make choices about the legislation, or even automatically participate in the debate over the legislation. So all legislation can be iterated upon, and so then you produce a piece of legislation, and then you have the moral graph say, okay, we like this, this, and this part, but we don't like these other parts. So, part of the negotiation can be not just Democrat politicians and Republican politicians debating over the piece of legislation, but then you have the third party, which is we the people, expressing our values against the legislation. For instance, with direct influence, basically whatever the politicians say, it must pass muster with us. Now, another thing is you can automate away politicians altogether. In some of the polls that I've run on my channel here, there's a good chunk of people who think that we should just get rid of humans out of politics altogether, and there of course there's also a good chunk of people that's saying that no, that's the last thing that you want to do. Personally, if we get to a point where AI is more reliable and more ethical than humans, I think that it makes sense to get rid of humans from the legislative process, or at least some aspects of government. But again, open to debate, and it should not be implemented quickly either way. And then, part of the moral graph could also be helpful in making that decision, because remember, the moral graph is about surfacing wisdom. It's not necessarily about commanding or controlling the government or the economy. It's just about what is the wise choice. So then you could say, okay, well, based on the moral graph, where do we want humans involved? And this information is probably going to be embedded in that moral graph. So basically we say okay, we want to reshape the presidency, right? So instead of one president, maybe we have a triumvirate and then an AI cohort or something like that. Just an example. So there are plenty of ways that you can use this moral graph on a national level, just immediately off the top of my head. Now, as promised, there are some pretty obvious flaws with this idea. So first is the wisdom of the masses. So the wisdom of the masses idea is the idea that collectively, if people are able to express their wisdom, their values, and their intelligence collectively, then we will make better decisions as a whole, as a group, rather than individual experts. Now, this is true in some cases, and this is a scientifically valid case, that collective wisdom is superior in some cases, but in other cases it's actually inverted. And so what that means is that the collective wisdom actually kind of pulls more towards the mean, kind of more the average, which is not necessarily going to be the best decision. And so this is one of the key tensions between, for instance, neoliberalism today, which neoliberalism, one of the things that neoliberalism says is that experts should be appointed to run things, which is why we have, the head of the Fed, and, we elect people. So rather than running everything by committee, we appoint experts. Now, one thing to point out is that, well, what if within a few years, what if AI is the expert anyways? And so then the moral graph is just directing the AI expert. So it might be a moot point. Honestly, I kind of think that that's where it's going to go, where rather than selecting a human expert to, run federal organizations and state organizations, we'll just delegate to AI, and then the AI, the artificial intelligence, will be the problem solver, but then the moral graph will be the, what problem to solve and why. So that's kind of how I honestly think it's going to be bolted together, is you'll have the moral graph bolted to the AGI. So the AGI is going to be like, I can solve any problem you want. And then the moral graph is, this is what problem to solve and why to solve it and how to solve it. But still, it is possible that the wisdom of the masses will still lead to suboptimal decisions. So if, for instance, the wisdom of the masses is less than the wisdom of artificial super wisdom, then the system will basically be forced to do what humans value, even if the humans are wrong or suboptimal. And one thing is, like, there might also be emergent properties. We have never coordinated humans this well on this scale, and so there might be hidden aspects of human psychology and group wisdom that surface. So one idea is Moloch. Maybe our id, takes over our unconscious, either our trauma or our greed or our competitiveness. That might take over, and that might be more emergent in a larger moral graph. There might be kind of demons hiding in there. We don't know. We'll have to figure that out. And then another idea is energy direction, because again, we humans, we are highly emotional creatures with our limbic systems, and so the places that we direct our energy to, that might be overemphasized, whereas there are real important areas that we don't direct our attention to simply because we're not aware of them as much. And so therefore there might be neglected areas of the moral graph. And so just by virtue of you focus on what you pay attention to, it's kind of like when a dog barks at the vacuum cleaner. The dog can't help but bark at the vacuum cleaner because it's loud and noisy, and so that gets their attention. Same thing, I think humans, we're a little bit more intelligent than dogs, but we still have limbic systems that call our attention to things, and meanwhile we might neglect other things that do need attention. So these are just some initial ideas right off the cuff that I could see as early flaws with nebulocracy. Now, there can be mitigations. So it's, just because there's problems, and again, remember, whether it's capitalism versus communism versus democracy versus fascism or whatever, socialism or nebulocracy, there's always going to be trade-offs in any system. It's just a matter of, which trade-offs are you most comfortable with making. So one is by focusing on values rather than outcomes, we're basically creating a moral graph, which is a set of heuristics or a way of making decisions rather than saying this is the specific outcome we want. And so you have better steering. And so this is one thing to keep in mind. And actually, the meaning alignment folks are very clear about this, is that the moral graph is not about charting outcomes. It's about very short term, moving from one state to another, and specifically moving from a state of lower wisdom to a state of higher wisdom. So in that respect, it's much more pragmatic and short term. And another thing, as I pointed out, is the moral graph might actually help us figure out when it is appropriate to appoint experts and say, you know what, the wisdom of the masses is not adequate here. This is how, when, and where we should actually create an expert or an agency in order to manage something. So for instance, the example that I like to give is, imagine the nebulocracy, the moral graph, does not necessarily have this specific wisdom about what to do about climate change. But it does have the values of saying, well, we all want a sustainable future. We all like nature. There's a bunch of things that we all like, that we all agree on. We like nature, we want sustainability, we like green spaces, and so on and so forth. And then we also agree, that there are certain things that we can do in order to improve our natural environment. And so then maybe the wisdom that is extracted from the moral graph says, okay, let's create a commission to study this further, or something like that. I don't know. Now, there is also the possibility that it does accurately accumulate collective wisdom of people, and that it is actually superior. It is possible that this technology will result in superior decision making. And then it could also come down to the actual implementation and execution. And so here's what I mean by that is, you can have the best idea, but if it's not well executed, it could still be worse. Because you could have good intentions, you could have a good theoretical system, but unless it is implemented and executed correctly, it can still go horribly sideways. So the devil is always in the details. Anyways, those are just a few ideas that I had right off the top of my head about, like, here's how we can make sure that if we do implement nebulocracy, how it could go better. Now, obviously, this is not up to one individual, and it would probably take decades, if not centuries, to fully explore this idea if we even ever try it. But what I want to point out is that this could solve coordination on a global scale. And imagine that you have, we have about 8 billion humans right now. By, the end of the century, we'll probably have about 10 to 11 billion humans unless something changes. So imagine that you have 10 billion people with different religions, different cultures, different geographic concerns, different genetic concerns, and everything in between, all trying to coordinate. Because right now we live in an anarchic world. So by anarchic world, I mean that there's no one force above all. The United Nations is very weak, and it doesn't have a whole lot of teeth. And so basically every nation is more or less on their own, with a few exceptions, such as alliances and those sorts of things. But right now, it's kind of, dog-eat-dog world. The way that I describe it is that the planet Earth is basically a giant petri dish, and we're all just amoebas. We're amoebas trying to make our own way. And nations are just groups of amoebas that happen to share a spot on the petri dish. So, in the long run, what if we have a way of coordinating the values and wants of literally 10 billion people? And we can understand, okay, whether it's, climate change or going to war or resource contention or even religious contention. What if we actually have a way of surfacing and collecting and aggregating the wisdom of everyone and finding places of agreement? From a structural standpoint, it is difficult to really articulate what that would mean. Imagine we can have a data structure. If you have 10 billion people and 1,000 data points per person, that's what? 10 trillion data points. So imagine you have a moral graph, a 10 trillion data point cloud that expresses the aggregate collective wisdom of all humanity. Now, that might at first sound a little bit outlandish, but remember, we have models that are trained on literally all the data available today. We can aggregate the collective intelligence of humans, and we're just working on the models and the data sets to aggregate that intelligence. So why not aggregate the wisdom as well? Why not have that be the next layer of the digital superorganism that we're creating? So maybe artificial intelligence, like GPT-5 and Claude 3 and those sorts of things, maybe that is the problem-solving engine of the global brain of the digital superorganism. But maybe the moral graph is the medial prefrontal cortex, the moral center, the ethical center of the brain that we're building, which doesn't say it's not just a matter of how to solve the problem, but why and which problems to solve and in which manner. So I'm honestly pretty excited about this. I hope we get a chance to implement or at least test something like this. And as we wind down, there are plenty of other uses of the moral graph. Obviously, there's many interstitial stages between right now, when they have a toy data set, and between when we have a global nebulocracy moral graph that coordinates literally all of humanity, because, that's pretty ambitious. So there's a lot of steps between here and there. So first is, and these are some of the examples that they give over at the Meaning Alignment Institute. First and foremost, you just replace attention engineering with meaning engineering. So instead of serving up content that is going to drive engagement, such as through, thirst trapping and outrage and disgust and fear, instead you serve people up YouTube videos and LinkedIn posts and Facebook posts and TikTok videos that they'll find meaningful rather than engaging. So that's the first use. And honestly, if Reddit and LinkedIn and all those other platforms, if they switch to a moral graph rather than intention engineering, I would give them another try. But right now I've deleted all of my social media because literally, except for YouTube, of course, but literally all social media, they use the same math. They use the same kinds of algorithms, so they all end up being equally toxic. The one exception is that YouTube allows you to subscribe to certain sources of information and block other sources of information. And so I pretty much only watch channels that I'm subscribed to. So I have curated my own information diet on YouTube. Next is community coordination. So you could use moral graphs in DAOs. This is actually where I think it would be incredibly helpful, is because one of the biggest problems with DAOs is, you can have quadratic voting and you can have all these other schemes to try and arrive at consensus, but humans are not necessarily the best at consensus, especially if they're not trained in consensus. But if you integrate a moral graph into your DAO, and DAO is a decentralized autonomous organization, by the way, so that's a kind of blockchain company. So if you integrate the moral graph, then all the people who are participating in the DAO, they don't vote, they express their values, and then the DAO knows the wisdom of the people that are involved. So that's one example. You can also coordinate local communities, so you could coordinate cities. So imagine that you have like a local town council, and there's there's the question of like, what do we do with this farmland? Or, a new meat packing plant wants to come to town. And so then rather than just voting, doing a straight up and down vote on, do we allow this meat packing plant to come to town? Instead, everyone expresses their values into a moral graph. And then the town council uses that moral graph to say, okay, not just answering the question yes or no, but under what conditions does the meat packing plant will it be welcome in town? And that's better for everyone, because then not only is the meat packing plant, if it is built, it'll be built in such a way that achieves 90% consensus and makes everybody happy. Now, of course, just because people get what they think that they want doesn't necessarily make them happy, because there's always the possibility for unintended consequences. But that's true no matter what you do. Event matching is another idea. So imagine if, rather than having to be invited to the meaning alignment event, what if I was on LinkedIn and it just said, oh, hey, Dave, you're in the space, you should check out this event. And rather than just using, the kind of algorithms that LinkedIn does to recommend stuff, what if it was able to say, hey, you need to get connected with Ellie. You need to get connected with Oliver and Joe. And it'll make those introductions. Because we've talked about, and I know a lot of you in the audience have talked about, I want AI to, solve loneliness for me. I want AI to solve friends for me. And honestly, finding the right people is one of the hardest things, especially when you're a weirdo like me and all of us in this audience, where you have very particular interests. And then it's well, how do you find those people? It's like finding a needle in a haystack. And all this goes to social media enhancement and value alignment. So pretty much anything. Anytime you need to align people, events, values, a moral graph could be useful. You could use it in groups as small as friend groups and families. You could use it within companies. You could use it in town councils and cities, and pretty much every scale of human association and human groups, all the way up to the entire planet, is where I think it could scale to. So with all that being said, if any of this resonates with you, get in touch with the Meaning Alignment folks. They are always looking for funding. Oh, and by the way, this is not sponsored content. I just like what they're doing, and they're friends of mine. But consider getting in touch. They're always open to funding. They're also open to research collaboration and resource sharing. So yeah, just get in touch. Meaningalignment.org. Contact page is right up there. Also on their main homepage, you can navigate to their research. And also there will be a link to their chatbot. And all that should be in the description anyways. So thanks for watching. I hope you got a lot out of this idea. Let me know what you think in the comments about nebulocracy. Personally, I think that's the way of the future. I think that makes the most sense because, I think a lot of you will agree that what we've got right now is only barely working. But particularly here in America, we have a increasingly flawed democratic system. And I think that the appetite for something new and better and different will be growing in the coming years. So cheers. Have a good one, everybody.